Proceed to our next panel, how to approach the current anti-Muslim hatred or Islamophobia in the world. And it's my great pleasure to have here as a chair of the panel, Kishan Manocha, who is the head of the Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Department at the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, OSCE in Poland. Thank you very much. And Kishan is also expert of our Article 18 Alliance. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Excellencies, dear colleagues, dear friends. Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you in particular for this opportunity to chair, moderate, facilitate this panel discussion. As Robert mentioned, I work for the OSCE's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, and our office is mandated to support the participating states of the OSCE, the world's largest regional intergovernmental security organization, to strengthen the human dimension of security, which really means strengthening respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, strengthening mutual respect and understanding within and across societies, respect for the rule of law, democratic governance, fair and free elections. And part of the work that I do, or a big part of the work that I do, is working to support states and civil society in addressing, combating all forms of intolerance and hatred, including anti-Muslim hatred, intolerance against Muslims, anti-Semitism, etc., and fostering interfaith dialogue and educational processes that build structures of peace, mutual respect, and tolerance. As we know, anti-Muslim hatred or Islamophobia is a serious and urgent problem affecting scores of societies across the world. It fosters discrimination, intolerance, hostility, and violence towards Muslim individuals, families, and communities, undercutting the ability of affected Muslims to be Muslim, violating their freedom of religion or belief and myriad other human rights, posing a significant threat to their safety and way of life, and if left unchecked, to the peace and security of societies as a whole. Indeed, anti-Muslim hatred is toxic to the democratic order and the values on which our liberal democracies rest, such as equality, tolerance, and the dignity of all people. The phenomenon of anti-Muslim hatred or Islamophobia is well documented, or has been well documented in a number of recent reports and studies. I want to cite in particular the landmark report of Ahmed Shahid, the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, in his report to the UN's Human Rights Council in March 2021, in which he unpacked the concept of anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia, including the processes of essentialization and racialization that propel this form of bias, in which he documented the experiences of affected communities and the impacts that this pernicious form of intolerance has on human rights. He affirmed the relevant international human rights framework and proposed important practical recommendations to address anti-Muslim hatred in a manner consistent with international law. We heard mention this morning of the recently published report from the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency, FRA, Being Muslim in the EU, Experiences of Muslims, which presents findings based on the experiences of almost 10,000 Muslims living in 13 EU countries, conducted between 2021 and 2022, which looked at the lived experiences of immigrants and their descendants. And as we heard, it demonstrates that half of all respondents face racism and discrimination in their daily life, a notable increase from when this was last reported in 2016. This is particularly worrying and represents an undeserved and unwelcome reality for those who've come to see Europe as their home, as well as those who've lived in European countries for generations. The findings show that racial discrimination has long-term consequences with adverse impacts on access to education, suitable employment opportunities, suitable housing, and in accessing healthcare services. A notable feature of this important report is the recognition that Muslims are often discriminated against, not only because of their religion, but also because of their gender, sexual orientation, ethnic background, or disability. So stacked on top of one another, these experiences worsen and deepen their experiences as victims. I should also point out that tomorrow, on the eve of the International Day of Tolerance, my office, ODIHR, will be publishing and releasing its annual hate crime report. This hate crime report is the world's largest data set on hate incidents and will, of course, report on hate incidents and hate crimes against Muslims in the OSCE region in 2023, including the impact of the events of the 7th of October last year and subsequently. And so I commend that report also to your attention. But I would say that despite its pervasive and well-documented impacts, the phenomenon of anti-Muslim hatred and or Islamophobia remains poorly understood, and discussions on how to address it are sometimes fraught with confusion and tension. That, I can assure you, will not be the case this morning, because we have a very distinguished and clear-sighted panel of experts who bring to this session, I should say, a wealth of experience drawn from academia, from civil society, from community engagement, and a host of other experiences. This panel will focus on understanding and addressing the rise of anti-Muslim hatred. It will examine the roots, causes, and drivers of this phenomenon, and most importantly, will explore, discuss, evaluate strategies to address this form of hatred, to engage communities and educate in terms of the nature of this phenomenon, but also as a means to inoculate individuals, communities, and societies from this. So, without further ado, may I introduce to you the panelists. Their full biographies are available, of course, in the material that's been circulated. On my immediate left is Saida Mirsadri, who is a research fellow at the Center for Comparative Theology and Social Issues at the University of Bonn in Germany. On her left is Farid Ahmad, who is the National Secretary for External Affairs of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in the United Kingdom. And on Farid's left is Surinder Paul Kaur, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Language and Linguistics at the University of Malaya in Malaysia. We were to be joined by Rabbi David Sandmel, who is the president of the International Council of Christians and Jews in the United States. But David is unfortunately unable to join us, but has sent a video recorded message which will play in due course. We're sorry he's not here, but he joins us in spirit. And as I said, we will hear from him shortly. I would like to kick off proceedings, if I may, by posing a question, the first question to the panelists, starting with Saida. In your view, what are the main causes and drivers of contemporary anti-Muslim hatred? And why is this phenomenon on the rise, as documented now in scores of reports and studies?
Thank you for your kind presentation and introduction. Well, if we would define Islamophobia as the fear of Islam or hatred of Islam, which is, again, a word that does not clearly define the content, because the object of hatred and fear are Muslims and not Islam. So the term itself is still not very defining and clear. If we would define the term as such, then the causes are the Islamic terrorist attacks of the recent years, and the rise of, as the first cause in the Middle East, but also in Europe, and the rise of Islamic fundamentalism and extremism both in the Middle East and in the world, which targeted Western countries, and the victims of which are, the majority victims of Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism are Muslims, but here depicted in Europe as the war of the Islamic world against the West. So these are the, one can say, socio-political reasons, but one cannot confine that to these elements because Islamophobia existed already before the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and the studies in Great Britain, in the UK started before that in the US. So it has a history. So it has a history, it has, of course, historical roots, this fear of Islam, this seeing Islam as the other or Muslims the other. And it started already in the 8th century when Christian West encountered the Muslim world. And during the Middle Ages, Islam was the other, but the rival other. So great civilization, a rival civilization, a military rival, a cultural rival. But still was the other. And up till to the colonial period where Islam and Muslims were again depicted as the other, but this time as the inferior other, so as subhuman to Europeans, where you can find the roots of racism there. So both this fear of Islam has in the European context or Western context or Christian context, historically this fear was there, always there, Islam as a rival civilization, and Muslims as inferior to the white Europeans, or Islam as an inferior religion to Christianity, is a fruit of the colonial period. So both of them exist at the same time as historical roots. But to talk about more social factors, there is this brilliant book, and I chose this book in order to refer, because the book is written within the French context, and we know that within the French context, the situation for Muslims is the worst within the European context. The book is written by two sociologists, French from the North African background, Abdul Ali Hajat and Marwan Mohammed. The title is Islamophobie, comment les élites françaises fabriquent le problème musulman. So it's like how the elite fabricate the problem of Muslim. So it is not an actual problem. Of course, fundamentalism, extremism, terrorism are facts, but the way Islam is depicted in the media or within the European context as the enemy is fabricated. So it's not, as I said, like the big number of victims of Islamic fundamentalism, terrorism, are Muslims. So we have to be united against Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism, like Muslim community here and European authorities, not that Muslims are against the West. So they in their book, which is like how the French elite fabricate the problem of Muslim, they say Islamophobia is systematically constructed by influential media and political elites. So the book is written in 2013, republished 2021 again. And these influential political media elites shape the public perception and the politics around Muslims and Islam. So media has an influential role there. Intellectuals have an influential role there, and policymakers. So this fear and hatred leads to policies against Muslims. So it's a kind of systematic discrimination. This fear leads to a kind of systematic discrimination. So they say, like media, that these French elites depict Muslims as the other, as incompatible with French values. And this is the case, unfortunately, within the German context, especially after the 7th of October. And this framing justifies laws that target Islamic practices, like bans on religious symbols. So burkini is banned, burqa is banned, and there is no surprise that Muslim women are the actual victims within the French context. And these two authors also mentioned that this is not a phenomenon that could be observed within the right-wing parties. All the political parties are engaged. For example, Manuel Valls was the one who is a socialist. 2011 was the one who not in charge, but was under him and his suggestion, there was this burkini ban. So it's not just a right-wing issue. Intellectuals in the French context, like Michel Houellebecq, who has written the novel Soumission or Submission, who depicts this futuristic projection where France will be governed by an Islamic party, or Éric Zemmour, who says famously, there is no Islamophobia in France, and everybody, by virtue of freedom of speech, is justified to criticize Islam. And what he does is not, of course, everyone can criticize Islam, but what he does is to call for hatred and hate speech. So what he does is hate speech. And the fourth factor is economic crisis. On that, there is this very good illuminating article written in 2018 by Dorian Bell, Europe's New Jews, France, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism in the era of mass migration, where he argues that that Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are key mechanisms through which European societies express anxieties stemming from economic insecurity and globalization. So, to answer your question, I just summarize again. There are four factors according to my studies. So, the first is Islamic terrorism, the rise of Islamic terrorism, terrorist attacks in the recent years, the rise of Islamic fundamentalism and extremism. The third one are the historical roots, like Islam as the other, whether as a rival civilization or as the humanity to the European white, and economic crisis.
Thank you, Saida. That was very helpful in unpacking the varying, or some of the causes and drivers, and helping us think about them in some detail. I'll hand over to Farid to build on that and to share your reflections in relation to root causes, drivers, but also the phenomenon, as we know, is increasing in both nature and scope and severity. And why do you think that is?
Thank you. I think you mentioned at the start about the statistics, and it's quite important to understand the scale of Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hatred. You mentioned that within the EU, around half of the Muslim population now feels anti-Muslim discrimination. That's about 13 million people, which is, I think, more than the population of the Czech Republic, just to give a sense of scale. And it is something that has a very real, hard edge impact on life. The ability to buy a house, rent a home, get a job, all these things that people take for granted, an increase in racial profiling, are the hard end of anti-Muslim hatred increasing. And in the UK, we've seen an increase in hate crime reported by Muslims, up 33%. And those are reported hate crimes. And that doesn't take into account all the other issues that are faced behind the scenes, as it were. In terms of causes, it is complex. It's an interplay between different factors, and in that we know there are economic drivers, there are political drivers, and social drivers. And these are compounded by, I would say, a lack of justice and fairness that we experience. We also know that these issues interact with other forms of hatred. So anti-Muslim hatred is, in the UK experience, certainly I would imagine is the same elsewhere, is linked to racism, is linked to other forms of identification that are then badged together and converge in terms of anti-Muslim hatred. In terms of factors, I would say a few factors I'd like to highlight. One is the economy. There was a saying by one of the American politicians that it's the money, stupid. If you follow the money, if you look at the economic shocks that the world has experienced and countries experience, these exacerbate the problem of anti-Muslim hatred. They are then looking for scapegoats to blame, as you mentioned about the othering of Muslims, that the reason that some people are worse off than others are falsely attributed to backgrounds, including religious identity. And we've seen that experience before in terms of race. In the UK, anti-racism in terms of against black people, against Irish people, And I wonder whether we are going through a phase of, is Muslim the new black at the moment, that we are being blamed for problems. And this is also amplified by political factors. We know political rhetoric is a powerful driver of anti-Muslim hatred. In many countries, India, we've seen the Citizenship Act, the rise of the far right in India. In the US, previous administrations talked about a Muslim travel ban, and in France, we've seen how these moves have led to legislation. And this rhetoric is there to divert attention, to present a false, I would say, unified identity that is presented to divert from the real problems, economic problems and other problems, and loaded on the shoulders of, in this case, the Muslim communities of those countries. And I think the worrying thing is where those narratives align themselves to certain aspects of far-right ideology. And I'll give the example of the UK. The whole debate about Brexit, and I'm really grateful to Robert for having the UK flag here, so we're still friends. The whole debate about Brexit around immigration had an anti-Muslim tone in that, wed into that. And what was worrying is that the narrative of anti-immigration, anti-Muslim is actually championed by the far right, but it's not completely rejected by other leaders either. So it gives it a sense of legitimacy. And that legitimacy gives authority and credibility to the anti-Muslim sentiment that we see. And therefore, the process of mainstreaming this experience is deeply worrying. And mainstreaming through legislation, mainstreaming through responses to international incidents or issues, global security. I think one of the challenges that we face is that politically, how things are presented and framed are critical. And as long as you have certain political issues framed in the narrative of religion, that is going to always play out in an increase in anti-Muslim sentiment, and indeed anti-Semitic sentiment and other faiths that are involved in that process. More recently, in the UK, we had the incident of the riots that took place against asylum seekers, but again, that had a very strong anti-Muslim element to it. And it's the old adage that a lie will make its way around the world faster than the time truth takes to put its trousers on. I think it's something like that. The UK riots were sparked by a rumor that people were killed, children were killed by a Muslim. Completely false, but by the time that truth emerged, the violence and the sentiment had already surfaced. And it also reflects that there's an undercurrent that exists and surfaces from time to time, possibly based on previous prejudices, previous experiences. It's difficult to say. The last 2 points I'd like to make is about the media and social media. The way these issues are framed in the media, the portrayal of Muslims in the media is negative. I can give you another experience in the UK. We were holding an event on peace, and we all know peace rarely, if ever, makes the news. The journalists came, they said, you're holding an event in response to the threat of Quran burning at that time, so are you going to be burning a flag? And we said, well, of course not. We said, well, then we can't give you coverage. So the way the media and social media operate is monetization, shock, trying to grab attention. And when you add social media into that mix, it's a really toxic situation. The monetization of news stories via social media, the consumption, I would compare it, maybe too dramatically, to, it's effectively like a drug. And there needs to be action taken against the drug dealers. The social media platforms that monetize and make money off these sentiments are rarely held to account. And it's the biggest, probably one of the biggest challenges we've got at the moment of how do you get people information that is accurate, and how do you educate them? Is there a responsibility on media and social media companies to educate, to provide a balance? The last point, I suppose, last couple of points on this is about fairness. Anti-Muslim issues rarely get, and the media portrayal rarely gets a fair hearing for Muslims. It is quite biased. and they portray and repeat allegations against Muslims that they are a threat to national identity, that they are a threat to our cultural heritage. And fascinating because in Europe you have a rise in the growth of Islam, a decline in religion, and the cultural heritage of the West is founded in Christianity, in the Judeo-Christian cultures. So Islam is a part and parcel of that story. So rather than being seen as a threat, it should be seen as something that faiths should get together to revive their cultural heritage rather than attack the growth of a new community. And on the principle of fairness and honesty, I think it's also true to say that there is an element of reflection. So the response of certain Muslim communities to certain issues do not help the cause of trying to tackle anti-Muslim hatred. There needs to be improvement on that. So we have to be honest about these things. But at the same time, I think the sort of predominant factor here is the sort of way social factors feed into the mindset of people. And if I could just close on my last point on this, is we are social creatures. We react to the environment around us. And obviously, if I believed everything I read in the media about Muslims, I may too be an Islamophobe. But there was a fascinating study in 1958 in the US by Jane Elliott on educational psychology. And in that, she wanted to teach children in a white area what it was like to experience discrimination. And she set the class and said, right, today, blue-eyed people are going to be the smarter ones, you get the privileges, you have the advantages. Brown-eyed people, you will have 5 minutes less playtime, etc., etc. That was day one. And she observed the changes in the behavior of children and how quickly they adapt and take on these messages in their behavior. And then day two, she reversed it, that the brown-eyed children were the ones who were better, smarter, and the blue-eyed are sort of inferior. The point is that the way those children react to these messages is the way humans react. And when we have a wave of misinformation against a certain community, we too form opinions and prejudices that need to be overcome, and it's hard work, and it takes courage to go against populism. And I hope in the Quran, they talk about when God was saying to the angel, I will send and create mankind. And the angel said, will you create a creature that creates mischief? And he said, I know what you know not. And the message was that, yes, there are people who will be mischievous and create problems, but mankind has the ability and the capacity to excel. So I hope with people in this room, we will show that how we can excel and overcome these problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farid, particularly for bringing into the conversation the role of social media as an incubator and accelerator of anti-Muslim sentiment, bias, hate, but also this point around the mainstreaming, the normalization of anti-Muslim sentiment, which is a grave issue, and with reference to the UK, how that's been played out, and not just in the UK, but in other countries in Europe and beyond. I'll ask Surendipal now to join the conversation. I just really wanted to hear from you, from everyone, but I just want to bring into this point, because it's been raised, I think, Saida, you touched on this, that Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred may or may not mean the same thing. So that's the first point to reflect on. And the second point is there are many detractors when it comes to Islamophobia as a term to be used in this discussion. There are many detractors who say this is not the right term for reasons that I think we've begun to think about. And then, of course, there's some who propose a working definition of Islamophobia. So I don't know whether you want to address those points, but if you do, that'll be fantastic, as well as anything else on these issues. Thank you.
Sure. All right. I'd like to start off by saying that there are very diverse articulations of Islamophobia, many different definitions of Islamophobia, and very often they seem to be very contextually specific and generally always polarized. So you do have, on one hand, the conflation or looking at the definitions of Islamophobia in terms of racism as well as religious prejudice. Then you also have extremist as well as mainstream definitions of Islamophobia, but you also have the state and non-state versions of Islamophobia. So there are many, many different ways of looking at Islamophobia. Now, very often though, what happens is that the definitions of Islamophobia tend to conflate two separate ideas, and this is what you just brought up. Items that pertain to Islam, which is a religious concept, and items that pertain to Muslims, which is a social group. So these are two different things, and very often they are interrelated, but very often they are conflated in definitions of Islamophobia. Very often, in terms of addressing Islamophobia as well, they are conflated. So these are things that we need to look at because Islamophobia is a very multi-dimensional issue. And Islams and Muslims are inextricably intertwined in this individual and public perceptions of Islamophobia. So what do we see in terms of global discourses on Islamophobia? What we see here is very often, as Saida correctly pointed out, and so did Farid, there is the whole othering of Islam and Muslims. So, A, you conflate Islam and Muslims. B, you other both, all right? And then this leads to the differentiation as well, between what we have, the normalized versions of civilization, as well, and on other is the Islamic Muslim versions of civilization. So you do have these two. So what we see here is the clash of civilization. What we have here is the focus is on Islamic civilization as a whole, which is considered incompatible with the core values of other civilizations, and as such, dangerous to them, to the concepts of let's put it this way, civilizations that adhere or perpetuate notions of hegemonic notions of modernity and progress. And sometimes, very often, various different Western civilizations do pick this up as well. I'm not saying Asians don't, they do that as well. So we do have this clash of civilizations. And then what this does is reifies the notion of Islamophobia in terms of Muslims, and then considers Islam and the entirety of the Islamic civilization as not being open to dialogue, and therefore not open to coexistence. And this is where Islamophobia takes its roots, because you start off on that premise that they are a threat to the civilization that is premised on notions of progress, on notions of modernity, whereas Islam is not, all right? And then, of course, this is why they can't coexist. So picking up on what you just said, these are some of those things. However, I'd like to go back also to the notion that not only do we other Muslims in general, but what was worrying is also the notion that the othering is occurring in the Muslim community itself. So you do have the notions of the good Muslim and the bad Muslim. So the othering is not just happening at the level of Muslims versus the rest of the world, or Muslim versus whoever. It's within the Muslim community itself. They are othering it by saying this is the good Muslim and that's the bad Muslim. So this causes a lot of issues when it comes to representations of Muslims across the world. What we find is Muslims across the world are a very, very diverse community. Very diverse. What happens is representations, media representations, create monolithic representations. They create basically the cultural diversity, the linguistic diversity, the lived experiences are completely erased or backgrounded. So we don't see the plurality. We see plurality in other communities, but not the Muslim community. It's almost always backgrounded or erased. So these are some of the things that are concerning where definitions of Islamophobia are concerned. And so I hope that takes up to some of the things that you did bring up just now.
Yes, thank you, it did. And that it is we will reflect further, no doubt, on this during the rest of this discussion, but it does seem that whether we agree on a working definition of Islamophobia or agree on the term itself, this whole phenomenon has, as we know, serious human rights impacts, including primarily, but not only, on freedom of religion or belief. And then we must think about the impacts on individuals, communities, and families, victims. None of that can be denied. All of that is very serious. All that requires us to engage deeply, well, and appropriately with how to mitigate against, prevent, and ultimately tackle in all their dimensions these consequences which have real human rights concerns and form. Which then leads me on to the second part of this discussion, which is to look at strategies, approaches to address, tackle anti-Muslim bias, Islamophobia, to think about things that work well, that have been attempted and haven't worked so well, and things that have been attempted, implemented, and have actually been perhaps detrimental to these efforts. When we think broadly in terms of strategies, of course, there's no need to limit them to community engagement, interfaith dialogue, education, but also how we tackle media misinformation, whether it be social media, whether it be mainstream media. There's a huge field there to think about. To kickstart the discussion, we're grateful that Rabbi David has provided a video recorded reflection, and so we will now play that, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm very disappointed that I am not able to participate in person in this important conference. I was excited to meet all of you and learn from you. I'd like to share a few thoughts about combating anti-Muslim hatred. Anti-Muslim hatred is unique in its causes and expressions, and these must be addressed in their specificity, as I'm sure my colleagues will do. Debunking stereotypes and countering mis- and disinformation are crucial, as is learning from Muslims how they define themselves. At the same time, I believe that education about the nature of hatred as a societal phenomenon, how hate operates and escalates and feeds on itself, how it can be exploited, should also be a key component in countering anti-Muslim hatred and other forms of hatred as well. Shifting the focus from any specific target of hate places the learners themselves at the center and provides a conceptual framework and tools so that learners can recognize hateful ideas, speech, and action in themselves and in others. Some of you, I imagine, are familiar with the pyramid of hate, which is one example of such a framework. If you aren't familiar, it's easy to find online. It demonstrates how hate speech can lead to social avoidance and exclusion, discrimination, violence, and ultimately extermination. This knowledge can then be applied to the specific instances of hatred that we encounter in our day-to-day lives. This kind of education can be empowering and transformative. I'd now like to say a few words about emphasizing diversity. One of the hallmarks of bias is viewing the other as a monolith, a single undifferentiated entity in which all members are basically identical. All Muslims are. Problematizing that perception of uniformity is, for many, an essential first step to greater awareness. Making the shift from all Muslims to some Muslims can be a turning point in the development of a more nuanced and fact-based understanding of the Muslims we meet in our day-to-day lives and of Islam. In this regard, I'm seeing, at least in some academic settings, the increased use of the plural, and I hope this isn't just an English thing, Islams, or Judaisms, or Christianities. When people hear this for the first time, it often provokes cognitive dissonance which is a powerful way to challenge misconceptions of monolithic groups. Since my work is focused on interreligious relations, I want to conclude with a word about religious leadership. Interreligious literacy should be, in my view, an integral part of the curriculum for all religious leaders and should include the experience of dialogue. Religious leaders, especially younger religious leaders, are important influencers. When they have personal connections with those from other communities and can speak from the heart about these relationships and model that friendship, it can have a powerful effect. Supporting these kinds of opportunities would be, in my mind, a smart investment. I'm well aware that the strategies I've mentioned here are labor-intensive and very grassroots-oriented. I also recognize that efforts like this will yield slow and incremental change. Therefore, they must be part of a wider, multifaceted campaign using all the tools available. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Owen. Rabbi David's not here to hear the thanks, but we will certainly convey our gratitude. I think he laid the ground very well in terms of highlighting a number of key strategies to combat Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hatred. So now I'll ask Surinder to continue the conversation, please.
Picking up also from David and some of the things that we stated earlier, the very first thing I think we need to look at is to address head-on the homogenizing discourses that are there. And we need to highlight that Muslims are diverse, they're heterogeneous, they're not homogeneous. So that is the first thing that we need to do. And it's not just that, we need to put forward the positive stories of how Muslims are integrated into the societies in which they live. However, these stories are few and far between, and these are the stories that should come out. And the other thing we need to do is critique the entire systemic mechanism through which Islamophobia is enacted. That is that of the clash of civilizations and the incompatibility of Islam with Western ideals. We need to critique that. And if we critique that, then we are critiquing the stance that the far right takes. We are critiquing the stance that, that draws a distinction between Islam and Muslims and the rest of the world, right? So we need to critique that, and we need to take a really, really hard stance about that. And we need to stop conflating religious Muslims with violence, because this, and I'm not talking about just in Islamophobia, I'm talking about countering Islamophobia. Very often in countering Islamophobia, addressing Islamophobia, we go back to that trope again. So by going back to that same trope, we are reinforcing the very binaries on which Islamophobia is premised upon. So these are the things that I wanted to bring up. But however, I wanted to go up to some very concrete examples as well of how can we approach the current anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia in the world. And I will take three different aspects of it. One is the media representation, and I will look at social media as well. And then I will also talk about a little bit about community engagement, but this is in tandem with social media as well. And finally, I will look at amplifying Muslim voices. So all these strings are integrated, and I do want to bring these up quite crucially, if you want to put it that way. So the media is a hotbed for misrepresentation. Very often, the representations of Muslims are based upon biological characteristics, upon racialized characteristics. So we do have that. And of course, added into the mix is social media, as Farid rightly pointed out, and Iman, I think you pointed that out as well. When you bring this in, you have this whole echo chamber of people who recirculate and reify those same dialogues again and again, the same conversations again and again. So how do we disrupt these conversations? How do we disrupt these representations? Well, the first thing is, we need to recognize the power of the media itself and the fact that the media has its agenda. The fact that the media has a certain frame in mind when they are representing Muslims or any particular issue in the world. And that's the framing that we need to disrupt. And how do we do it? Well, media literacy is one, but we need to engage with journalists. We need to engage with not just the journalists, but the powers that be, because the journalists are doing their job. Right? They are told do this for clicks, do this for this, do this for that. It's the ideological background of the owners of that particular news center or that media center that needs to be talked to. The dialogue is essential there to understand that there are many ways of representing people. So that's one. The other thing is promoting media literacy and critical thinking amongst people in general. Not to read and say, well, that is the whole truth and that's how I'm going to accept it. We should be able to look at it and critique it ourselves. And I do find that over in the last few decades, there has been less and less emphasis on critical thinking skills and literacy in this sense. And even when it comes to social media, digital literacy, because people who are in their echo chambers think that's the world. Everybody thinks that way. So this lack of digital literacy is something that we really need to address. So by doing that, we can focus on reducing the stereotypes. I'd also like to bring up the whole notion of social media and it being an echo chamber. Well, it doesn't have to be an echo chamber. I think we're living in a world where there are huge technological advances every single day. We're looking at ChatGPT 4, 5. We've moved on, so much. We've got algorithms that can help us. So these are the algorithms that need to be brought into play when we are addressing Islamophobia in social media. The first thing is the platforms need to be taken to task. They need to be taken to task. They need to embed algorithms within the platforms itself that can recognize hate speech. And not just that, but can collect data to look at new forms of slurs, new forms of representation that fall into the category of discrimination and prejudice. That's the first thing. The second thing is fact-checking. Every social media platform should have that fact-checking dimension to it. No matter what happens, whoever posts whatever, there must be an automatic fact-checker that comes up and says, this isn't quite accurate. The more accurate way to represent this would be A, B, and C. The third thing I would like to say is leverage upon the algorithms of AI. I mean, AI itself. AI can look at predictive tools and you can look at the trends of conversation on social media or even in media themselves. We can look at the trends in the last 10 years, in the last 5 years, in the last year, in the last month. Where are the spikes? And when the spikes come, you can predict when the next spike is coming. This is where intervention comes in. You can actually release content. You can release curated content, quick and easy, to rebut what is being stated. And very often we tend to be a bit complacent about that, and we tend to use very traditional means, but we can actually use the power and leverage of the affordances of the tools that we are presented with in order to address this particular phenomenon. So this is one of those things that I wanted to bring up. The other thing I wanted to bring up is the whole notion of community engagement. I think it's essential that we engage with communities, and it's essential that we engage with both Muslim communities in order to engage with other communities. So we need to have that particular thing, breaking of fast, iftar, and things like that. In Malaysia, it's a shared communal experience for everyone. So there is a cultural understanding of what this is all about. So that kind of engagement needs to be present, and it needs to be emphasized on a regular basis. The other thing I wanted to talk about is amplifying Muslim voices. What we have here, as I said earlier, the positive stories are not talked about too much, but by amplifying Muslim voices, we are able to bring out the positive stories. We are able to bring up different narratives that can counter the effects of Islamophobia and can counter Islamophobia by itself. So these are some of these things. Social media is amazing when it comes to some of these things, but it's not the only tool. We do have many other tools. And I just wanted to go through a list of certain things that we have here. So the first thing is we need that the word is difficult on my tongue, plurality of Muslim representation in the media. We don't need homogeneous representations. We need diversity. We need plurality. And I believe the RIS test is there. I think those of us from the UK, those people from the UK will be I think it's modeled after the Bechdel test. And It's created by the filmmaker Riz Ahmad, and it looks at how Muslims are represented in film, in TV, and it challenges the producers to depict Muslim characters without associating them with violence, without associating them with terrorism, associating them instead with their lived experiences every day in their everyday lives and the contributions that they make to society. The other thing is the other media professionals, journalists and things like that, they look, the Muslim Women's Media Network, that has come up with many different ways. They offer workshops, networking events, mentorship opportunities where Muslim women are put front and center, and they are the voices of other Muslims. And it makes sense because you see, women are the ones who are actually victimized in many different ways, not just through race, religion, but also through their gender. So these are the things that, some of the things that have worked and are working right now. Campaigns on social media, you've got hashtag my name is campaign, all right? And you've got other campaigns that talk about, my hijab, where women actually come up and talk about their experiences about wearing the hijab and what it means to them. So this counters the narratives that are put forward by a very homogeneous right-wing, hard stance that actually doesn't even see the diverse experiences or the lived realities of people. So you do have that. I think one of the key things here is media training for editors, journalists. That's key here. And how are we going to do it? Well, I am at a loss. I'll be honest, at a loss, because this is a really hegemonic industry we are talking about, and a hegemonic industry with very, very strong ideological stances. So, however, foundations can do their work. You can have resources where journalists can learn to recognize the stereotypes, because what is most damaging is not just the overt representations of Muslims as violent or radicalization, that's there, but the more insidious, normalized representations. All Muslims are like this. So if journalists can learn to avoid those pitfalls, it really helps. So, there's much more that I can talk about, but I think for now that's about it, really. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a very full response, very helpful ideas and pointers to what we should be doing. We are doing many of those things, but what we can do further and better. And I was waiting for the moment when AI finally made its way into the conference, because we live in an age where AI is almost, all-encompassing, it's omnipresent. I don't want to make too many God-related analogies here in relation to AI, but we know the challenges it poses, the adverse impacts it has, but of course it is also a force potentially for good, for tolerance, for promoting equality, respect, and I think you've touched on perhaps a feature of AI that could be used in terms of countering anti-Muslim bias online. I'll now ask Saida and Farid to add to this, particularly your thoughts on opportunities that we haven't grasped in relation to what is missing, or what we can do better. So I'll ask maybe Saida or Farid. Who would like to go first? Farid? Okay.
I'll say a few words, then pass on to my learned colleague. I think the opportunity, as touched on earlier, social media is not going to go away, but we need it to be regulated. And I know countries are trying to find ways to do that, but in the same way that we regulate other aspects of media, I think time has now come. It can do a lot of good, but if it's left unchecked, it will do a lot more harm. The second thing is that I think for leaders and leadership in particular is, we talk about Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred, and I could describe it as there are lots of fires that are out there burning, as a result of this. So leadership should stop starting new fires. There's two ways to solve a problem. One, you do not make it worse, and second, you take action to the problem that's already out there. So nuances and terminology that's used by leaders, I think, needs to be carefully thought about and reflected. And then, of course, education, as has been mentioned already. It is absolutely vital, because in this day and age, the attention span of people, and children in particular, is shortening. the way they're learning is through shock value of short videos, short messages. And that system needs to change. So I think there's a challenge to the education system of how do you put that into place, because by putting that step into place now, you will have hope for the future. And lastly, I would say words matter, terminology matters. I think you mentioned that it's very important to distinguish between the faith and the actions of people who claim to follow that faith. And I think that's really powerful. Islam, Judaism, Christianity are religions, noble religions, and I think we need to make a conscious effort to distinguish, to separate. You could almost say a separation of church and state, separate the issues, the political issues, from the faith. That will have an impact on how people perceive problems. You talked about the allegations that Muslims do not integrate. Interesting, because it comes often from countries that have colonial histories. You have issues where Muslims are described as Islamic extremists. That terminology is not used to describe other extremists based on faith. So words matter and they have consequences, and these are small steps that can have huge impact in society. Thank you.
Yeah, I would also just underline what was already mentioned, that, like, as you said, like amplifying the Muslim voice. Just to give concrete examples of my experience of living and working in Switzerland and Germany, and monitoring the society in France, where Muslims are not present in the media or politics. The fear is bigger wherever it is. So in the case of Switzerland, when you go to the streets, you hardly see Muslim presence. So they have like 5% of the population are Muslims, just as big as the Muslim population in Germany. But when you go to the streets, you do not see women, hardly see women with headscarves or dark-skinned Muslims. Well, Muslims are racialized and Middle Easterners are Muslimized, but you don't see them because the majority of Muslims in Switzerland are from the Balkan region. So you don't see their presence in the society as to get the fear. But Islam is always the topic of controversy in politics. So, Switzerland is the only country on earth where minarets are forbidden. And you don't see Muslims in the society. I don't know where from comes this fear. So 2009, there was this very famous picture. There was this referendum whether it's allowed to have minarets or not, and the majority said no, because the propaganda the right wing made was like a poster they made where you see the Swiss flag with the minarets in the form of missiles on the Swiss flag and a woman with burqa. On the street, you don't see any woman with burqa, and based on statistics, only 40 women in the whole population, 8 million population of the Swiss wear burqa. But burqa debate is always present in the politics, in the media, and it's also banned. Minarets are always the topic of discussion, whereas you hardly see halal restaurants, you hardly see Muslim appearing women or men on the street. Whereas in Germany, Muslims, you see Islam on the streets, and the fear is less because Muslims are very present in the media. Muslims speak for themselves. And if you compare with France, Muslims are not in the talk shows or in the media. It's talked about. So France has the largest Muslim community in Europe, and you do not see them in the media talking on their own behalf. They are talked about. The same in Switzerland. So the case of Germany for me is like a successful case where you have Muslims speaking in the media. Germany established 2011 Islamic theology in universities because they said Muslim students have the right at school to get education about their own religion so that they would not go to that Salafi imam and get the education there. So they started with 5 centers. It grew now to 7 centers where they in academia, they teach Islamic theology. But still Muslim community do not trust them. And unfortunately, after the 7th of October, the atmosphere, like in politics and the media, is so Islamophobic that trust is lost. So it was a successful case. Germany is a successful case which unfortunately after 7th of October, all the trust which was built between the Muslim community and the government is now to a very big extent lost. So there is a way, there are hopeful, there are projects that were successful, but it can at any time, at critical moments, change and shift. So.
Thank you, Saida. Thank you, Farid. Well, we have a little bit of time still for reflections, comments, reactions, and questions from the floor. So the floor is open. Yes, we have a hand there, please. Tell it.
Professor Kaur talked about the issue of representations. Just to quote a few key words I wrote down: representations, othering, bias, prejudice, misinformation, conflating religious Muslims with violence. Now, I'd like to just last two terms: misinformation and conflating religious Muslims with violence. If it's an issue of misinformation, and we're interested in, and she also said that dialogue is essential, and I definitely, of course, agree with this. Now, if dialogue is essential, and dialogue is about not trying to score political points or engage in recreational rage, but to solve real-world issues, and it's an issue of misinformation, I am looking for the information. I can't seem to find proper statistics on opinions in the Muslim community about things they're being accused of. If they are being accused of being conflated with violence, I'd like to see statistics on what the actual opinions. In other words, instead of just scoring political points, I'd like to see what the opinions actually are. I'd like to see a list of the statements of leadership, Muslim leadership around the world. I think it can easily be compiled in good faith, a list of what they believe factually, not just television pundits. I'm aware of statistics that were done in statistical work that was done in the vicinity of Peshawar in Pakistan, a survey that was done in Bangladesh, which showed that there was a large support for violence against Shia, against Ahmadis, Jews they didn't even ask. And I'm wondering whether, and of course I can reference the Munir report, the foundational moment after the anti-Ahmadi riots of 1953, the Munir report of 1954, where the foundational moment of liberalism in Pakistan, where a Pakistani judge in 1954 seemed very keen on addressing the actual issues of communal violence in Pakistan and called all the religious leaders to testify before the committee. Now, I'm curious whether a Munir report could be compiled, could be done in good faith in Europe, and whether, if we actually want to solve the problems, we could compile statistics, compile the statements of leaders, and address the communities in good faith to try to address things that actually need to be fixed if they are found to be so.
I think we had a bit of a sound issue. Would you like to just very quickly, in a nutshell, just distill your reflection into the actual question you'd like the panel to do?
Yes, I am Yishai Rosenman from Jerusalem. I work at Charaka NGO, an NGO that deals in diplomacy with the Muslim world, particularly with the Abraham Accord countries, but with the Muslim world in general. My question was, if it is an issue of misrepresentation, and there are attempts of political point scoring and recreational rage, shouldn't we be interested in getting the actual information, exact statistics about in other words, Muslims are being, Professor Kaur said, are being conflating religious Muslims with violence. I wanted to ask, shouldn't we have actual statistics and compilation statements by leaders of Muslim communities on whether they do or do not believe in violence against Shias, Ahmadis, Jews, hudud punishments, etc. Shouldn't it be more factual, have statistics, statements, and then try to address the actual issues rather than engage in point scoring and Twitter battles?
Yeah, thank you for that. I absolutely agree with you. There should be people coming forward to make factual statements, backed up with statistics, backed up with data. I'm a big fan of data, and you should have that. But my question to everybody here is, does the onus only fall on the Muslims to do this?
No, of course not. Everyone, yes.
I think we need to work as a collective, because by doing that, we're again drawing a distinction. It should be a collective collective that works together, that says, okay, there is this kind of discrimination and prejudice, this kind of misrepresentation, and we're going to address this. Then there is this. There are many different kinds of misrepresentation. As a collective, as perhaps I'm being very idealistic here, as humanity, it is incumbent upon us to take responsibility to correct a whole bunch of misrepresentations. But maybe Farid, you have something to say?
Thank you. I mean, I agree. I mean, there should be facts, so a collection of facts, and it should be, I think, broader than just Muslims as well, because it's in the interest of the broader community. I mean, you mentioned about the Munir inquiry and the violence against Ahmadis and Shias and other communities. It's interesting, the Munir inquiry report actually concluded that when they asked the people who are carrying out the violence, can you define what a Muslim is? And no two Muslims could agree on a definition. Now, you could argue that may apply to other faiths as well. But the point of that inquiry was to say that people should have the right to self-identify, and that's a right that I think is upheld by the Quran and other scriptures. So I think in my sort of remarks I said that there needs to be honesty in the debate, and I mentioned that the reactions and actions of some Muslims do not help their cause. And I would also agree that the same applies to other faith communities as well. The difference, I suppose, is the perception, at least, that the magnification of what happens in the case of Muslims appears to be far greater and disproportionate compared to others. So a search for the facts would be very welcome.
Thank you for those responses. Are there any other questions or reflections or comments on the floor? Looking around? Yes, please. Over there, yes. Could you introduce yourself and then...
Okay, hello. My name is Michal Pelíšek. I'm from the Federation of Jewish Communities here in the Czech Republic. And I have actually two remarks. First one is that I would like to just to mention that the word you are describing is completely different to the word of my experience. And I just wanted to share with you that my experience is completely different. And the second is that if we are talking about Islamophobia or anti-Muslim adversity, I have a feeling that it comes mainly from the fear and experience of extremism, Islamism, and violence and terrorism. And I would like to ask you, because I have not heard much about it, what is the position of the representatives of the Muslim communities against the violence of the Islamists? Because I have really not seen much of it. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know who would like to address that.
Thank you. So if I've understood the question correctly, you're saying what is the position of the Muslim community on violence? Is that correct?
Not just that, but also why I don't see any like showing up the position. Thank you.
Okay. So why it's not forthcoming after incident? I think it's interesting because in the UK, I'm from London, so we feel that we've apologized a lot after every extremist incident. Statements are issued condemning the violence and also clarifying how the faith does not support such violence under any circumstances. And the challenge is always getting that to be portrayed in the media, which prefers to portray provocative voices rather than voices for peace. So that's the shared challenge that we are ready, willing, and have many times, and this is true across different Muslim communities, to speak against violence. The challenge is how do you get that across in the media when the media isn't interested? So certainly happy to talk to you afterwards as well, but there is a sort of consistent denial, a consistent action on our side, and that will continue because that's our duty. And that will continue against all forms of violence, be it by so-called Muslims or be it by other faith communities as well. Because faith is about peace. Whichever faith people belong to, it's about peace. So we will always stand up for peace.
Well, as I mentioned, I think I've mentioned, we admitted that there is violence amongst Muslims, and the victims of the violence are Muslims. Like, they are not just Westerners. The big number, based on its statistics, 80 to 90% of the victims of fundamentalism in the Muslim world are Muslims. But the view is very Eurocentric. So if there is a terrorist attack in Charlie Hebdo or something, the whole world talks about it, and the whole world expects that Muslims condemn that. But like Hazaras in Afghanistan, they're Shiites. They are being killed systematically by Taliban. There are terrorist attacks, and so nobody talks about that. You don't even hear about that. Or like ISIS politics, they were like, their agenda was against Shiites. So how do you expect us to condemn that? We don't regard them as they are Muslims, of course, but what they are doing in the name of Islam, we don't accept it. So why should we condemn it? So I think your question is a bit Eurocentric, not seeing that the big victim of fundamentalism and violence amongst Muslims are Muslims themselves. And what is here presented is Islamic fundamentalism against the West, which is a wrong narrative, which is a very Eurocentric narrative, because you don't hear about Muslims being killed in the Muslim world through terrorism, acts of terrorism.
Well, we are approaching the end. We have, yes, with just very brief, Mohammed, yes, please.
But I felt, I don't want to take the floor, but I felt I need to speak here. And this is reminding me an old story, that we are not hearing much about the condemnation of extremism, violent extremism from the Muslims. We understand that a number of fatwas, a number of positions were set in the past couple of decades, absolutely correct. Now, I wanna mention a couple of things. One is that we need to acknowledge extremism and religious extremism exist in all religions. And let's acknowledge, to my knowledge, that there is no mechanism or there is no structured mechanism right now in an inter-religious dialogue in addressing those extremisms, right? So you talk about the Ahmadiyya or all of that, the Sunnah and Shia, there is no platform to have a discussion. Similarly, in the Jewish community, you don't see a platform between different Jewish denominations addressing some issues pertaining to extremism in the Christian communities and so forth and so on. We need to address that first, then before we move to the interreligious aspect of it. So we have to address that first. Now, and then there is a collective responsibility of religious communities. If a specific community came up with condemnation of extremism or terrorism, it is the responsibility for the other faith community to make that available. Example, in the United States, when the Muslim community after September 11th issues a position on terrorism and religious extremism, you know who put it in the National Press Club and carried it live on C-SPAN on all the media? It was the evangelical communities. Did the luncheon of the month. The evangelicals, they did that just to promote it, and they accepted the document from the Muslim communities. Thank you, Zisha.
Thank you, Mohammed. I'm looking at Robert to see if there's any way we can extend this. No, we can't. So I'm sorry, Iman. We have to defer or continue the conversation over lunch, and I wouldn't want to put myself between you and lunch. That would make me the most unpopular person in Prague today. But I, on your behalf, in drawing this panel discussion to a close, want to thank our very eminent contributors and panelists, to Saida, to Farid, Surindapal, for their excellent, insightful, rich contributions. I think we've covered a lot of ground. There's a lot more ground to cover. That's why we have the breaks, and that's why we hopefully will have further events like this to build on these important conversations and to extend our understanding into new areas. So thank you all. Enjoy lunch, and I think we reconvene in an hour for the third panel session. Thank you.